Anton Pavlovich Chekhov was a Russian physician and supreme short story writer and playwright. Had a huge and strong influence on the course of modern short stories and plays. He published more than 400 short stories and sketches by the age of 26. Chekhov was born in the Russian village of Taganrog in 1860. His father was the owner of a grocery store. His mother was a storyteller under whose influence young Chekhov is said to have acquired a gift for narrative. In 1875, his father's business failed. His father fled to Moscow. In 1879, Chekhov was admitted to medical school. He assumed financial responsibility for the family, and while attending classes at Moscow State University, he wrote and sold a large number of humorous stories and vignettes of contemporary Russian life. He used to describe his relation with medicine and literature by saying, "Medicine is my lawful wife and literature my mistress. When I get tired of one, I spend the night with the other." Some consider Chekhov to be the founder of the modern short story, and his influence is observed in a diverse group of writers of all languages. In Urdu literature, Chekhov has special importance for us, as our first short stories in the early part of the last century were inspired by him. He had himself some doubts about his place in Russian literature, wondering where he would stand in comparison with his great forerunners like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. He does not seem to have recognized that, being the first great bourgeois writer in that literature, he did not have to stand in relation to them in a traditional sort of way. He was the founder of a new phase in it. Chekhov focused on internal drama and psychic projection, rather than the traditional plotting of unfolding action, subtly blending naturalism and symbolism, and comedy and tragedy in a unique way. In Pakistan, PTV has taken the initiative and adapted one of his plays in late 80s. Some other theatre groups like Dastak, Napa and Theatre Wallay also adapted few of Chekhov's plays. National Academy of Performing Arts has done well to stage his Seagull in the Arts Council in Karachi. The play is, in many ways, autobiographical, though more in the sense of Chekhov's self-perception at a certain period than in actual happenings. Theatre Wallay staged his two plays, The Proposal and The Bear. The performances were directed by Fizza Hasan, who founded this commercial group of artists over 12 years ago. Fizza says, Chekhov has always been a personal favorite. No other writer explores the depths of contradictions in human nature better than the Russian playwright, she said.
As a theatre person, I've experimented with Chekhov's plays several times. Why Chekhov? I think his characters are extremely relatable and extremely real. The most serious amongst them have a comic side. The funniest amongst them have a sad side. I think that all of us can find something to connect with in Chekhov. We can actually easily empathize with the characters and understand where they're coming from, and why they do what they do. One of the best things about Chekhov is how he can see the comic side in the serious, the eccentricities of otherwise very ordinary people, and also how he can see the pathos of ordinary people and ordinary lives. It's something that sort of lifts the mediocre into an art, and that is something about Chekhov that always appeals. it's always a great experience to delve into Chekhov as a director and to create a slice of life, because that is really what Chekhov does show you, a slice of life in ordinary people's lives, um, ordinary people who are living in an extraordinary moment and creating something amazing out of that. That is what I really, really like about Chekhov. Chekhov can be very challenging because on the surface the characters seem so ordinary, that it's really hard to play them. You can't overact them. You can't sort of pretend to be those characters. You really, really have to get into their skin, and that is a very long process. You have to figure out where they're coming from, what their backstories might be, what in their lives would have made them behave in the way that they're behaving at that particular moment on the stage. That's never an easy one. So if you have a huge tragic hero, it might actually be easier to figure out where he's coming from than if you have just this bad-tempered man who enters the house of a widow to get his money and ends up falling in love with her. And you wonder where he's coming from, what his experience with women has been, what it is that would make him behave in this manner, and why that sudden change of heart. So you actually have to find the coherence in his characters, and you have to build that coherence. And as a director, you have to guide your actors in a way that they will be able to find that coherence, because without it, the Chekhov will fall flat. If your characters do not make sense, if they are not coherent for your audience, then the magic of Chekhov is lost. From an audience point of view, it's always a delight to go and watch Chekhov. Again, I think because we can empathize, as audience, we can empathize with the characters because we see bits of ourselves there all the time. Because they're just people like you and me who just happen to be watched at a particular moment in time, and we laugh with them, we laugh at them, we cry with them, and we just basically we feel for them because they're so very human.
His hundreds of stories concerned human folly, the tragedy of trivialities, and the oppressiveness of banality, and were written in a clear, simple style with realistic detail. His plays emphasized character and mood over action, and told of the desperation of the lonely and self-absorbed, and the miscommunications they are prey to. Considered among the greatest of Chekhov's stories are A Dreary Story, 1889, Ward Number 6, 1892, My Life, 1896, Eonage and the Trilogy, The Man in a Case, Gooseberries and About Love, 1898, and The Lady with the Little Dog, 1899. Among his plays, the later works are the most renowned: The Seagull, 1895, Uncle Vanya, 1900, The Three Sisters or Three Sisters, 1901, and The Cherry Orchard.
Well, there are many great writers in the world, but there are only a few who have got some distinct literary style, a style that has earned them a certain literary term associated with their names, like Borgesian, like Joycean, like Freudian. Chekhov is such a writer whose distinct style has earned him the literary term Chekhovian. I think there are only two primary ways of writing a short story. One is associated with the French writer Maupassant, the other is associated with Chekhov. Maupassant gives an accidental turn to his story at the end of his story, but Chekhov usually takes an ordinary person or an ordinary situation in his story, and he just takes a part of life and just describes it which seems usual or ordinary, but after reading that, we think that it's extraordinary. Uh, he has a certain kind of humor as well, which is associated with his style, and that humor we can see in such stories as Death of a Clerk and Chameleon. And often his style is very lyrical, and his narration is very beautiful. Like he starts his story with the description of nature. Um, his characters are also very particular, and he is very assiduous in depicting those characters. He has a very keen eye for observing those characters, and he has very keen ears for catching the nuances of their language, the particular language of his characters, for which they remain stamped in our memories. Most of his characters are seeking something. They are not satisfied with the way life is going on. Um, there is a muddle in their lives, or there is a muddle in the world, and they are seeking romance in that world, in their lives, or they are seeking meaning in their life. Like in his story Lady with the Dog, there are two characters who are leading normal, routine, ordinary lives, but now they are seeking romance. The girl is married, and she's seeking romance. Um, and there is another story as well, The Russian Master. In that as well, the main character is a teacher of Russian literature. He is also seeking romance, but when he gets the romance, when he gets married to his beloved, he is still not satisfied. He thinks that um, the norms of society and the ordinariness of the society is surrounding him. He's like the system is surrounding Mr. K in Kafka's trial. So the norms and the mediocrity of life is surrounding the main character of this story, The Russian Master. Chekhov has a great impact on world literature. We see that there is an American Chekhov, Raymond Carver, there is a Canadian Chekhov, Alice Munro, and there is an Irish Chekhov, William Trevor. In Urdu as well, Chekhov has a huge impact. We have got our two greatest short story writers are Manto and Rajendra Singh Bedi. Manto's style is associated with that of Maupassant, and Bedi's style is associated with that of Chekhov, which is that he just takes a part of life, ordinary part of life, and describes it, and while Manto gives an accidental turn to his stories at the end of his stories. In Urdu, Chekhov has been widely translated. Most of his stories are translated into Urdu, like Intezar Hussain translated one of his longer short stories, The Steppe. He translated it as Ghaas ke Maidano mein, and Muhammad Salimur Rahman translated his plays. One distinction that Chekhov has is that he is not only a great short story writer, but he is also a great playwright as well. My association with Chekhov began when I was very young, and this was the first volume of his short stories that I read, The Russian Master and Other Stories. This is not the same collection that I read. I bought it afterwards. I returned the first collection that I read to the library from which I had taken that book. But then I read Intezar Hussein's translation of the Steppe Khas Ke Maidanon Mein. But my favorite story of Chekhov is Lady with the Dog. I really admired the romantic atmosphere, the lyrical narration of that story, and one thing that I like in that story is that it doesn't have a particular end. Like there is no end to the story of life. So most of Chekhov's stories continue after they end. They continue in your minds as well. So they never end. Like life never ends, or the story of life never ends. So I go again and again to Chekhov to seek inspiration in his stories. I'm very fond of reading him again and again. That's what I wanted to say about Chekhov. Thanks very much.
In 1890, Chekhov conducted a survey of the medical and living conditions of prisoners at the Siberian penal colony of Sakhalin. The study involved a long and hazardous journey across thousands of miles of Siberian wilderness, which would have been taxing even for a well man. But Chekhov seems to have been a person who quickly wearied of his life and became bored with his surroundings and acquaintances. He was always traveling about and visiting different cities in an attempt to find an elusive satisfaction. On this occasion, he returned to Russia on a voyage, which went through Vladivostok, Hong Kong, Singapore, which he thought depressing, Ceylon, which he loved, and Port Said. In 1891, Chekhov visited Italy and France with a friend. The following year, he bought an estate at Melikovo, near Moscow, where he lived with his family until 1899, one of the most settled periods for the restless group. Chekhov provided free medical care for his peasant neighbors and financed and oversaw the building of schools in the district as well as a dispensary which he ran. His later unromanticized depictions of peasant lives were much influenced by these experiences. He also apparently began his first affair around this time with Lydia Yavorosky, an actress at Moscow's Korsh Theatre. In 1894, Chekhov met the Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy, who he greatly admired, though their views were often differed. Some feel that Chekhov's more romantic portrayals of the peasantry were written in an ill-guided attempt to emulate Tolstoy, and that Chekhov was more true to himself when he presented the poor, warts and all. Chekhov's play, The Seagull, opened in 1896 at the Alexandrine Theatre in St. Petersburg. Under-rehearsed and poorly cast, it was a disaster, and the production closed after only 5 shows. Chekhov was devastated and swore never to do any other play, though he was already at work on what would become Uncle Vanya. In 1897, Chekhov suffered 2 hemorrhages and was hospitalized, forced at last to recognize his illness. He wintered that year in Nice, France, where he was contacted by Vladimir Nemirovich Danchenko, who, along with Konstantin Stanislavski, had founded the Moscow Art Theatre. Nemirovich Danchenko and Stanislavski were excited about The Seagull and wanted to stage the play, which they did in 1898 to thunderous applause. Though Chekhov, the dramatist, and the Moscow Art Theatre's fates were intertwined from this point on. Chekhov often despaired of Stanislavski's naturalist and tragic interpretation of his plays, and the director's tendency to overplay Chekhov's subtle and understated scenes.
About Chekhov as a playwright and as a short story writer, as I have always found him to be a very fascinating playwright, and his influence can be rated as the second greatest influence on world literature, other than William Shakespeare, especially. Chekhov's plays reveal a remarkable pattern which is absent in world literature before him, that is of subtextual storytelling. His characters, his stories do not do things overtly. He does not follow the event templates or the established traditions of dividing the plays into the acts, but rather he adopts a different pattern, which was more based on monolithic story writing and how the meanings and the texts and the feelings are conveyed more through silence rather than through the acts or through the voices of the actors. So that is one of the fundamental distinguishing traits of Chekhov, and it really sets him apart from the playwrights of his generation and even from the generation to come. The way Chekhov has influenced our modern storytelling is basically more in the domain of plays, less in the short stories, which I don't think would be to the Chekhov's liking, because he considered his short stories as his premium work and not his plays, and he gave more attention to his short stories rather than concentrating on his plays. The biggest influence we have on the current storytelling by Chekhov is the Stanislavski's method of acting and the way it has influenced the actors of our generation. That is, I think, the biggest innovation Chekhov has had. And in if we talk in terms of Urdu literature, the influence left by Chekhov is basically on the way our dramas were sequenced. I can specifically name a few playwrights like Khaja Muinuddin and his plays. They feature a lot of inspiration from Chekhov, the way he uses irony and to contextualize his message is basically directly inspired from Chekhov. And then subsequently, we also see many of the earlier plays from the PTV era that they follow the same patterns that Chekhov has left on the world of playwriting. So, when we talk about the influence of Chekhov in playwriting, it is very evident, especially when we see modern cinema, when we see modern television, the way now the stories are told, the way the actors act, the way the actors convey the meanings and try to establish their roles. It is quite evident. And I think this is one of the biggest legacies that Chekhov has had. In the field of short story writing, I think the way he uses his characters, not the events, to convey certain meanings or certain conclusions is an important aspect and needs to be analyzed separately. That how that has influenced our literatures, and that influence is really evident in the English literature, not that much in the Urdu literature, because the short story writers in Urdu had different influences. Uh, Even in modern Russian literature, we see that Chekhov is still owned to a great degree. The plays are still staged. As I said earlier, the biggest number of adaptations after Shakespeare are the plays of Chekhov, and that I think is the most the prominent symbols that the Chekhov's legacy lives on, because even today we find his messages, his context, his way of storytelling relevant to us. Even the modern cinema or the modern television find the way he tells a story a way that they or a template that they can follow. And such sort of timelessness achieved by Chekhov should be a beacon for all the writers to achieve. And it is really an interesting thing to note that Chekhov himself was not sure of his legacy, and when asked that for how much time people will be reading his books after he has passed away, he normally used to reply 6 years, centuries to come. And that I think is the best thing about the way he has influenced our literature, that he has influenced the format, not the message. So since the messages keep changing according to environment and the formats remain normally relevant or stationary, so that is an important thing, and we should always remember Chekhov as one of the greatest playwrights that our generation or any generation will ever be able to emulate.
For his health, Chekhov moved to Yalta in the Crimea, where he continued to write. In 1900, he became lovers with an actress at the Moscow Art Theatre, Olga Nipper, and the two married in 1901, though the union was a distant one, with the couple spending long periods of time apart. Over the next few years, Chekhov's health steadily worsened, though he continued to write. In 1904, he traveled to Baden-Württemberg, Germany, on his doctor's orders, traveling with his wife. While there, he suffered 2 heart attacks and woke one morning gasping and ill. He called for the doctor, announcing when the man arrived, "I'm dying." Then he took a sip of champagne, considered salutary for heart attack victims, remarked that he hadn't had the beverage in ages, and promptly died.